Happy Wednesday, and thank you all for joining us today for this very special Lunch and Learn session on Lean Experimentation and Culture Building. My name is Erin Munchik. I am the Program Manager at GuideWell Innovation, and it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Rajiv Menon, founder and CEO of Informulate. Rajiv, thank you so much for being online with us today.
Thanks for having me, Erin.
Great. So before I hand it over to Rajiv to get started on the content today, I wanted to go ahead and just review a couple of housekeeping rules and also provide a brief overview of GuideWell for those of you who haven't joined a session with us before and are first-time viewers. So again, thank you all for joining us. So we kindly ask if you all hold the questions until the very end of the session. And to ask a question, you can just go ahead and simply raise the hand symbol on the control panel, and I will be happy to unmute you. That way you can speak directly to the group. And if you didn't have a microphone, or if you wanted to just go ahead and not use your mic today, not a problem at all. There is a chat function where you can go ahead and type in your message, and I'll be happy to relay that to the group as well. Just in case we don't get to all of the questions today, we can absolutely connect offline. I'll go ahead and add my email to the chat. And then, of course, Rahiv's whatever contact information he wants to provide, we'll be sure to provide that for you all as well. So now let's briefly talk about GuideWell here. So GuideWell is actually, let me go ahead and grab the slides here. So GuideWell is actually the parent company of Blue Cross Blue Shield, also known as Florida Blue. We're a nationwide company present in 35 states, and we serve over 16 million individuals. So we're going to talk now a little bit about GuideWell Innovation. So here at the GuideWell, including GuideWell Innovation branch, we view ourselves as a health solutions company. And the team that I have the pleasure of working with here at the Innovation Center are key players in that effort. So our mission is to reimagine the future of health through entrepreneurship and innovation. And we do that through multiple funnels, as you can see here. So we opened our doors in 2016, and we've had great success in our first 5 years, 6 years, 2021 of operations, as you can see from the stats here. We actually just celebrated our 5-year anniversary, which was an exciting milestone for us. The center serves as a co-working space for health and wellness-driven companies. We launch and host entrepreneurial challenges and initiatives, both nationally and statewide, to source solutions in healthcare technology. We run accelerator programs and mentorship opportunities for scale-up health companies. And lastly, we serve as a venue for event hosting and a great space for company gatherings and meetings. So we are pretty busy over here, but we're always looking for new opportunities. And I'd be happy to discuss offline any of these outlets that I just mentioned to you if you do have any questions. In the meantime, if you do have questions about GuideWell Innovation, I encourage you all to go ahead and visit our website, guidewellinnovation.com. Alrighty, thank you all for bearing through that intro. I'm going to go ahead and switch it over to Rajiv for today's content. So thank you all, and let me go ahead and switch it over to you. Just bear with me as we switch screens.
All right, thanks, Erin. Can everybody see my screen, or Erin, can you see my screen?
I can. If everyone can just go ahead and provide us with a little thumbs up, if you can see the screen, or a little hand raise. There we go. Beautiful. We're good to go.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I know your team and you are doing some great things, amazing things out of your Lake Nona Center. And it's a pleasure to be doing this event with you and GuideWell Innovation. Thanks for having me. All right, well, I hope everybody's doing well and staying safe in these interesting times that we live in. Can you believe it's Q1 2021 is already done? Time flies when you're having fun, I guess. All right, so who is this for? This talk today is intended for people who are in new product development or working in a team that is associated with new product development, either leading it or being a part of it. Of course, if you're a startup or associated with a startup in any way, that's new product development by default. And of course, if you are trying to make roadmap decisions on an existing product and you're not sure, you're making some trade-off conversations, that would also be something that you would gain value from. So our talk today is called Lean Experimentation and Culture Building. We are going to be equipping you with some concepts and some tools on how you can perform lean experimentation. And whether you're just starting out or whether you're an expert in new product development, I think there's something in it for a lot of different people, especially some new techniques that are not as well known, and hopefully we can bring some attention to. And as part of that, of course, if you start applying some of these methods and techniques, then hopefully it influences your culture to start asking more questions, being more proactive, and taking ownership as well. So that's our scope for today, and I'll briefly touch on the agenda. We'll just run through a little bit of terminology in the beginning, disambiguate some phrases that we bandy about and use that might help to be clear about what we're talking about. Talk about the problem statement of why innovation is generally not that easy, some approaches and solutions we can use to make it easier, methodology specifically lean startup, which we'll dive into in a little bit, some tools and some experiments that you can use in your daily or ongoing work in new product development, how that changes the approach and how you actually accelerate your learning. We'll talk about culture, and finally I'll give you a handful of resources there that you can explore and benefit from over the longer term as well. All right, I'll just reintroduce myself real quick. I am the CEO and founder at Informulate. We're a software consulting company based here in Orlando, Florida. What's different about us is we apply innovation methodology in combination with our product development and software development services in order to make sure that the products and services we deliver actually result in ROI for our clients, which is, of course, always the objective of any investment that a client makes in software. I'm also quite involved in the local Orlando community. I'm the founder of the Lean Startup Orlando meetup group, which I invite everybody on the call to join. There is some information at the end where the URL to go log into that. We talk about innovation methodology. We meet once a month. I'm the current chair of the Orlando Tech Council, which is a program under the Orlando Economic Partnership. We have a council with multiple committees there that if you're interested in being a part of leading the community, you have ideas and ways to contribute, or if you want to be a part of helping make our community more innovation focused, then please reach out to me and we'll be happy to connect you. Also a mentor or a rally maker at the Rally Central Florida Social Enterprise Accelerator, and I'm an organizer for Startup Weekend Orlando, which is Swirl. And that's another event, that's an annual event where we have people come in, form teams, and it's a competition style event over one weekend to launch a new product or a service. And I'll brag on that a little bit. Of the last 3 years that I've been organizing that event, 2 of those 3 years, Orlando teams have won the Global Startup Weekend competition across 150 cities. That is something we're all very proud of. So it is truly something to be experienced to believe. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I will have some information towards the end of the talk as well. All right, so innovation, that's what we're here for. What is it? The word innovation has its roots in nouveau, or Latin words which relate to the word new, right? So you're doing something new. And there's not a great definition out there for it. So I've cobbled together a definition from different sources, which is innovation is delivering a new value proposition or an existing value proposition in a new way to an existing customer or to a new customer. So the new part has to apply to either the value proposition, the way that you deliver it, or the customer. And of course, there's no point in innovation if you're slow. So speed is assumed in innovation, is that if you're being innovative, the speed at which you're innovating is really the key of innovation as well as delivery. All right. There are some different types of innovation. So incremental versus disruptive. Incremental innovation is when you're applying it to further an existing product or service. It's not any less innovative if you're adding it to a product or service in terms of the value that it generates. For example, you could argue that the first iPhone was a major innovation, but if you look at all the generations of iPhones and all the changes that have happened and how much more that impact has spread across the world, you could argue that incremental innovation is pretty useful. A disruptive innovation is not when you just create a new product or service, but you create a whole new category. And you could certainly argue that about the first iPhone, where the category sort of existed, but it just exploded that to where smartphones was a whole new category of service, of product. Creativity versus innovation, if people often say, conflate the two, there is a difference. Creativity is just coming up with something new, but innovation, as we described and defined earlier, is actually delivering that value from a new value proposition to a new customer in a new way, is actually making life better for somebody. So you could be creative, but if it's not helping anybody, it's not changing how they work or live, then it's not really an innovation. That's the difference. Process versus culture. I like to say that culture is what your employees do when there isn't a process defined for it. By that I mean a process is, you have multiple steps. You define this is how we do invoicing. This is how we do accounts receivable, whatever the case may be. That's a defined process. But culture is what allows your employees and the decisions they make with what they do and how they do it and how much proactivity exists within your organization is really the difference between process and culture. But having good process could help you to get better culture. So there's always that. All right, with that said, let's talk a little bit about the problem statement. Why is innovation hard? Why isn't everybody doing it, even though everybody's talking about it? A lot of things apply. Fear being the number one thing. There's the fear of failure. Hey, I'm going to try something. I'm going to fall on my face. I'm going to fail. There's going to be embarrassment. We're going to lose money. We're going to lose credibility. I'm afraid of my competitors, what they might do, how they're moving ahead of me. So there's a lot of reasons why a fear-based culture will never truly be innovative. So that's important for us just to know and recognize and accept, and then hopefully compartmentalize and put away so that we enable ourselves to work without having fear playing a role in our decision making. I don't know if a lot of people have heard the phrase or the coined term hippo before, but it refers to the highest paid person's opinion, right? So the highest paid person's opinion usually carries the day in most meetings, in most conversations across the world. So if you're higher up in the rung and you say, hey, I think we should do this, chances are everybody's going to agree with you. But the problem with that is, of course, that you have, if there's too much deference to that leader, then you're never going to have the kinds of conversations that allow you to see the whole picture and be truly innovative. The other piece with that is confirmation bias, right? A lot of leaders and I guess every human being has confirmation bias. It just varies to the amount or the degree to which you have it. It's just assumed that you have it, right? Including me, including every leader, everybody out there has confirmation bias because we have a certain set of experiences and we make decisions based on our past experiences. And when you're talking about something new, that literally the word innovation is doing something new. So when you're in that new space, you don't want your past experiences when you're doing something new to over bias your decision. You really want to be open to understanding this new thing that you're trying to do. The other problem in most organizations is silos. The larger the organization, the bigger the silos. There's literally companies that have gone to where they prevent certain groups officially from talking to each other because they're like, hey, we don't want to have all of these conversations happening and people wasting time and it's inefficient and we want everybody to focus on what they're supposed to do. That is operations, right? You can have efficiency of operations if you have people over specialized and they're doing one thing and they're doing it well and they're able to do a lot of it, right? For example, you could argue that Amazon has squeezed a lot of efficiency and productivity by keeping its warehouse people super focused, hyper focused on whatever their warehouse activity is. They don't get pulled into other conversations necessarily. That's their one task they're supposed to do, one job that you have, right? But are you going to get innovative ideas from your employees if that's how you treat them? Answer is no. You have to know what you're doing and how you're building that culture. So Obviously, Amazon is a super innovative company, but they have a different group for that they're relying on that innovation there. So it really depends on what rules you apply, and you're very conscious about how you make those decisions and what is going to be siloed, what is not going to be siloed, and where we expect our innovation to come from. So it's not like you expect every single person to be involved in every single conversation, but you just have to be intentional and know where you expect that value to derive from. The other piece is vanity metrics. We have a lot of companies like to pat themselves on the back, nothing wrong with that. But if you're patting yourself on the back, you don't want to then get complacent. So looking at how many people hit our website and it's going up every month, that's great. Number of social media followers going up every month, that's great. But if your sales aren't going up and they're going down, then the metrics that you were looking at previously don't really hold a lot of water. And this is especially true of marketing, because there's so many metrics you could look at that look great. You know, we've got more people clicking on our ads and things like that. But if sales is going down and other things are going down, the leaders need to move the conversation to the metrics that matter and not rely on vanity metrics. One thing here is that all of this friction really boils down to the leader, right? If the leader isn't on board and the leader isn't asking for innovation and understanding the trade-offs that they have to make in order to allow innovation to really happen in their organization, then it's not going to happen. Basically, the leader is the cap, the ceiling on the innovation potential of an organization, right? So if you have a leader that says, we just don't have these kinds of innovative people on our team, that's probably true. If the leader says that, that's probably true, because they didn't select for that. They didn't prioritize it. They didn't train for it. They probably didn't reward it. So they don't have it. And it's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to that kind of thing. For example, if you think about Steve Jobs at Apple and how innovative Apple was, and then he left, John Scully came in, there was a huge dearth of innovation there. Steve Jobs comes back, innovation begins again. You could argue that with Bill Gates at Microsoft, with Ballmer, and then transitioning to Satya Nadella. My opinion is there was definitely a period in those companies where you could literally see how an innovative leader brought out the best in their teams, and not, and vice versa, when they're not really thinking that way, when they're thinking more from an operations perspective versus an innovation perspective. That's a big difference in perspective. So the other trade, I mean, when you're trying to solve these problems, having an innovation culture means a lot of talking, especially in the early stages. There's going to be a lot of questions, there's ideas and answers and explanations. That is the cost of innovation. Chatter is a sign of engagement. So if a team member asks a hard question, a bad leader will shut the question down. A good leader would attempt to answer the question, and a great leader would connect the question to the larger purpose, or even better, gets the employee to answer that question and then connects it to the larger purpose. That is really the difference in creating that engagement and culture that we talked about, and moving from these failure situations and the friction to a truly smooth innovation culture. All right. Now, the good news is this is a well-studied problem, and there's a lot of tools and methodologies out there. Three of the ones that I like the most are design thinking, lean startup, and agile. They are very similar in some respects, have a lot of overlap in some respects, especially around iteration. They're all three are about iteration, but they have a slightly different angle to it. Design thinking is very focused on building customer empathy, and their steps of empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test really has a lot of techniques around building customer empathy. Lean startup is designed around experimentation and speed of learning, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And agile is really about execution. How fast can you turn something around? So it's about the speed of execution and how consistent it is and how fast it is. All right, so we won't get into detail on all three, but we'll be going into some detail on lean startup here. All right, so Lean Startup, this book has definitely had a tremendous impact on my life. So if you haven't read the book, please reach out. Happy to get you a copy. The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. There was definitely a lot of talk about innovation prior to this book coming out. There's plenty of things that have happened since then, but for me, this is kind of a seminal book in that it went to the New York Times bestseller list, and it really changed the conversation about how innovation gets done and made it more accessible to a lot of companies. So it is a methodology that focuses on identifying the highest risk and value and focusing your attention there instead of the 100 things that you could be doing, but really having a methodology to find out what are the top 2 or 3 things that you really need to focus on, and then make data-driven decisions for those high-risk things, right? Don't make decisions just based on hippo principles or what has worked for you in the past or confirmation bias, but move towards having the data drive your decisions. You want to speed up value creation, and you want to limit your biases in the group, and you really want to unlock creativity and empower teams to get that innovative culture that we talked about. There are a number of concepts under Lean Startup. I'll just go through the list real quick, and then we'll of course spend most of our time talking about experimentation here. Leap of faith is what they call the big assumption, the big hypothesis that your company or product team is making, that hey, if this thing works, if we can solve this particular problem for our clients, then we can charge X amount of money for it, right? That's your leap of faith assumption, is does this value exist? There are 2 main hypotheses in Lean Startup. It's called the growth hypothesis and the value hypothesis. The value hypothesis is that if someone tries your product, the value that you promised them is actually going to work. That is, you take this pill and it's gonna it's gonna be relieving your pain, right? So if that pain relief happens, that means your value proposition is good. You have delivered the value you promised. If you didn't, then your value proposition is weak, or the value hypothesis is weak. The growth hypothesis is, how do you get people to try your product for the first time? So you have a pill, it solves your problem, great. Doesn't mean you're out of the woods. You still need to get people to know about it. You still need people to identify that it's going to solve this particular pain that they have. And you still need to convince them that they can trust you to solve this problem. And you need to do this at scale, right? Your cost of marketing and everything like that falls into the assumptions around the growth hypothesis. How do you do that? Well, by designing experiments, by getting out of the building, going out and talking to your customers, building an MVP, a minimum viable product, and being agile in terms of how you deliver these different increments of value. The other phrase that Lean Startup gave the world is build, measure, learn. The build, measure, learn loop is how you experiment. So you build something, you measure how that thing is performing, and then you learn from it and you iterate. Now, of course, you want to know what you're going to measure, so there is a step in front, which is basically, it'll make it a 4-step process, not as clean, but you do want to know what you're going to measure, what your thresholds are going to be before you start building. The 5 whys approach is one of my favorites. It's very helpful in retrospectives, where you ask the question why, and whatever the answer is, you answer with why again until you find some root causes and some root things that need to change in your organization or in your processes. The pivot, another great phrase for that Lean Startup gave us, pivot or persevere based on the data. You want to always be ready. The more emotionally attached you are to the result, the less likely you are to be able to pivot from that. So pivoting and being ready and expecting a pivot to happen is a key mindset shift. Innovation accounting is how you keep track of your innovation, because it's really hard to have an ROI. But if your innovation accounting is focused on learning, then that is measurable, and you should be able to accelerate your pace of learning. An adaptive organization is one that embodies all of these concepts and is responding to the market appropriately. All right, with that said, there are plenty of tools you can use to accomplish these things. And I don't have time to go into each one, but I'll just list them out real quick. Persona canvas. So this is when you are trying to identify who is your customer segment, what is unique about them. That'll then help you make your pitch to them, right? Understanding what they care about, what they don't care about, what tone they use. Persona canvas is helpful for that, which is a standard marketing tool. Business model canvas helps you map out on a single page all the major aspects of your business, such as your value proposition, your marketing channels, your revenue streams, your partners, and so on. There's 8 sections on that page that we use to identify or to map out your business. The value proposition canvas is extremely helpful, especially for new product development. It really maps out what exactly you're doing for your customer, the pains and gains and the pain relievers and the gain relievers. A very useful thing to go through and do as an exercise for your team. Experimentation board is really where you take all that stuff that you did before and then you craft experiments like, okay, this is our biggest risk, this is our biggest hypothesis. How do we run an experiment to validate that hypothesis, right? And then of course, Kanban board is how you keep track of your tasks. And from an Agile perspective, you can have a backlog working on things and then done lists that helps you see the velocity of how your team is progressing. These are some tools that I have used and really enjoy using, and I highly recommend them. Here's our experiment list. So this particular slide is high value. If we are recording the session, so you can go back to it later too. But there are many ways. This is just a sample of the different ways that you can test your hypothesis. And this is one of the things that really exploded the experimentation side of Lean Startup that was brand new, was the creativity of how many ways can you validate your hypothesis. And I'll talk about, where do you start, right? The where do you start question is going to be answered shortly. But just looking at that list, there are so many ways, and how many of us have used some of these ways to validate a product feature before we build it, right? Standard procedure was you build it and hope they will come, but that's not true anymore. And the techniques that are available to us in 2021 or for the last 5-6 years, rapid prototyping tools, so many other ways to test things. This is a whole set of things that you could do to experiment. I'll just call out a couple. So for example, Wizard of Oz, right? Let's say you're building uh, an AI assistant that's going to answer some questions, right? But maybe your biggest assumptions are around, that you can make the AI assistant work. So that's not a big risk because you've tested that, it works fine for you. Okay, let's assume that is a lower risk in your mind. But what customer, let's say you're solving a problem for an AI assistant for a nurse, right? She doesn't have time to go enter stuff, so you're going to enter stuff for her. You could have a fake assistant set up. You don't need to go build out every system in order to do a Wizard of Oz test. So you have the man behind the screen effectively who is listening to what the nurse is saying, making notes or answering questions or whatever. It is very easy to do. So it reduces your cycle time of getting validation that the nurses are getting value from this, so you can de-risk your value hypothesis. It's similar to the concierge test, but it's different in that you're actually doing something akin to consulting in the initial phase before you end up productizing it. There's, picnic in the graveyard where you're having a conversation or lunch with people who've tried this product and failed in the past, so you can learn from their mistakes. You have data mining that you can do. You can have clickable prototypes. There's, you can do a landing page where you see how much interest is there for a particular marketing phrase or interest in a particular problem statement. There's a lot of different ways to get validation. A quick call out here, this is kind of some of the things that we practice in our Startup Week in Orlando event. So if you're interested in actually getting a working session on this, Startup Week in Orlando is coming up in October, November. And if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll know exactly, and the tickets will go on sale shortly. But every single year that I've been a part of Startup Week in Orlando, the winning teams generally generate revenue in the first weekend. How often do you hear that? An idea that was pitched that weekend generates revenue every single time, every single event. There's somebody who does that. And they do that using one of these methods. All right. And of course, it's not a one-time thing. It's iterative and it's collective. It's really hard to get out of confirmation bias if it's just one person. So you really need it to be a collective exercise. And every single field that you fill out in the business model canvas or the value proposition canvas is a hypothesis that you can then experiment on. We talked about the value and growth hypothesis. You definitely want to start there. And if that's done, then you go to the next top 3 risks and opportunities and focus on that. But it's always about continuous experimentation. The more that something is unknown, the more qualitative you want to be in your research, and the less unknown it is, not but unknown, the more quantitative you can be and more specific you can be about your thresholds. And then you decide at the end of those experiments whether you want to pivot and persevere, and then you iterate. So here's how we decide where to start. The Real Startup book is a book written by a friend of mine, Tristan Kromer, who is a leader in the innovation community, a global consultant, and he actually was one of our first speakers at Lean Startup Orlando. He's based in Silicon Valley, and he's done a lot of work in this space. This is a collaborative book that he and a lot of innovation leaders wrote together. So it's a co-authored book. It's online and free. It's a PDF download. And I really love how he has simplified these quadrants, right? And where to start with what. So though, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the more you know about something, the more quantitative or metrics driven you can be. The less you know about it, the more open-ended and qualitative you want to be. And qualitative is also called generative research. Quantitative is also called evaluative experiment. So that's kind of how that plays out. That quadrant there is an intersection of four segments. On one side, you want to learn about your market on the left, and on the right, you want to look at your product. And so first typically you start with your market, right? Because you're 9 times out of 10, the biggest risk that you have is just your understanding of your customer and your segment. The 1 time out of 10 is something that is a sure hit, right? If you had a cure for cancer, you don't really need to experiment on, will my customers want that? Yes, we want that. The risk is more on the value hypothesis and can you actually do that? So then you would focus more on product. But 9 times out of 10, when you're in new product development, it's about understanding your market, your customer, and their unique pains and gains, right? So you would start with that. Generative, qualitative, open-ended questions in the top left corner, where you're literally talking and doing customer discovery with your customers. And then once you have a rough idea of how you can craft some experiments and you have a little bit more information, you can create evaluative experiments around your market, which is the bottom left, the dollar sign, where you can actually say, hey, are you willing to pay me in advance for this and this service? And if that pain is strong enough, you can get it. And that's what Startup Weekend proves every year, is that people will pay in advance for services, for things that they really care about. Then you go to product and you do some generative research on that, qualitative, hey, if I solve it this way, does it work for you? Or do you think I would rather solve it this other way? Because for every single customer, they have multiple different pains and gains that they want. And for every single pain and gain, you have multiple ways of solving that problem. You could solve it through an online service. You could solve it through a physical service. You could have a product delivered. There's a lot of different ways of solving any pain and gain. So part of this process is to unlock the reality that, your preferred approach or what you started with in mind, like, hey, I have a thing that could do this thing for somebody else. That's not the only way to solve that problem. And so the generative research is going to open up that world for you of where, hey, how do I solve this problem? Let's look at everything, all the different ways I could do this. And then once you have that idea nailed down, then you go into experimentation with an MVP. All right, moving forward. So here's a set of questions, and this is also a very good slide, which I use often to make sure that we ask some of these really good questions, qualitatively or quantitatively. So open-ended questions generally start with how and why. Closed-ended questions generally like, what am I doing and what are people thinking about this and how much will they pay, is more quantitative. So questions like, how should I design this? What is wrong with this? You have to kind of figure out through conversations with your clients on how that's going to happen. And then, is this our customer? You can run a landing page test for that and send that email to that particular customer segment and see how many people respond to it. So that's more quantitative. And if you put a threshold in front of it where you say, hey, I'm going to think that this experiment is a success if at least 30% of the people I send it to agree. And you should have those thresholds set up before you do your experiment. You need to have a threshold of success and failure so that you don't move the goalpost once that experiment begins. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm sure there are questions here, but I'll make sure to leave time to go over them. Here's some questions around market versus product. Market is the intersection of your customer and their problem. So who's our customer? What are their pains? Are really the market-related learnings, and the product-related learnings are how are we solving this problem? Out of all the ways we could solve it, which is the right way? How important is the design? And questions like that. All right, so I'll definitely, you can always come back to those slides there. I won't read all the questions there. But again, as I mentioned, it's about learning, but it's also about the speed of learning. And if your team is not fully invested and taking ownership of the process of learning, which is a very different objective than the process of delivery, the process of doing, we will not get the results that you wanted. So you need to mix the agile culture with the lean startup experimentation to get the best of both worlds, which is what we do here. So all the stuff we talked about that's external to the customer, to the market, to the product, that's all great. But if internally you don't have the right culture, you're not going to be able to really get the speed of learning that you want. What prevents us from doing that? Well, here's the 5 dysfunctions of a team for anybody who's read that book: absence of trust, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, inattention to results. Those are some of the dysfunctions. And from there, we want to move people over to the AMP principle of Agile, which is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is our desire to be self-directed. It increases engagement by decreasing friction and compliance, things like that. So if people are empowered to do and express themselves fully, then you have more autonomy. That's going to get them to want to be master their skills. They want to get better at it. There's a major motivation to be unlocked if people are really trying to master their own skills and something that they personally identify with. And of course, that personal mastery has to connect with the organizational purpose. And if the organizational purpose is something that has meaning and is important to them, then the desire and the connection between autonomy, mastery, and purpose is very, very powerful. So that is, I'll give you an example here, especially in Formulate, we try to make sure that, when we have a major problem that we're brainstorming, we're trying to get something done, we discuss the pros and cons, but we don't stop there. As a leader in the group at Formulate, we need to be able to zoom up a level and show how does that connect to our culture? How does that connect to our principles? So it's not just a matter of solving a particular problem, but the way we arrived at that solution and the particular choice of solution that we ended up going with has to connect with why this is how we do things at Informulate, for example. And I'm sure a lot of companies have that, where it's like, this is the Toyota way, this is the, Apple way. Similarly, you have to build your own kind of, this is how we make decisions kind of way here. Curiosity and the 5 whys, we touched on that before. That's super important. There's no learning without curiosity. You can't wait for learning to come to you. You have to go ask for that. You have to seek it out. And all of this is, of course, made much more powerful when there are actionable group retrospectives where the whole group is getting together and talking about, hey, this is what we did in our last sprint or last month, and whatever time frame is reasonable. Here's what we learned. Here's what we failed at. Here's how we can get better. And then really having actions come out of that, right? Here's what we're going to do different going forward. That is a really powerful exercise. No matter, you could take just the retrospectives and you'll still see value there. So I'm a huge fan of retrospectives. All right, so does this stuff really work? It does. It's not going to solve every problem, and just because you're following the right methodology and you're following the right process doesn't guarantee that you have for example, the right skill set for delivering that. Or maybe your assumptions were bad and you only found out much later. It can help you reduce the time to finding out that this was the wrong assumption, but it doesn't necessarily get you, it doesn't guarantee a result. But the main thing about these methodologies is to improve your chances of success. And that's really all any methodology can do, is to put you in a better position than you were before. For example, you can look at the case studies that are out there for Lean Startup at Dropbox, Intuit, Kiva. Dropbox is one of the first case studies listed in the Lean Startup book. They started iterating their product faster in order to test what customers really wanted, and using Lean Startup principles in 15 months, Dropbox went from 100,000 registered users to over 4 million. So there are certainly things we can learn from how, and in these case studies, there's a lot of case studies out there too that you can learn from that might be more relevant to your organization. At Informulate, we have kind of 3 clients where we've, I'm calling out here plenty of times when we have applied innovation principles and agile principles. One of them is at a top 5 international university where we have a wellness program that we are building for them, and we help them to really make data-driven decisions where we derived metrics for employee engagement that didn't exist before. So we crafted this new metric which allowed them to see kind of year over year, month over month comparisons of are we moving in the right direction. And once we had that, the conversations were made much simpler because we were able to align on things that do help move that needle and things that don't, which then resulted in simplification, email follow-ups, things like that, which caused engagement to go up by 25%, and then created that culture of experimentation where like, yeah, now let's do this thing and see if engagement goes up or not for this particular part of the program. At AirHealth, which is a local startup here, we engaged with them in an agile way. We were iterative. We have 3-party engagement with tight deadlines and quite a bit of churn on who was doing what because it is a startup and things are moving quickly and we had to keep up. So part of what really helped there was regular retrospectives, asking the why questions, and creating that culture of being oriented around who is this solving the problem for, how are we solving it, and let's think through all the aspects. And then we were able to bring the team together and deliver the product that they wanted. At Massey Services, also a local company, they knew they had a problem and they had the seeds of a solution. But the challenge was how do we coordinate all the different silos within the organization, and how do we bring together the solution that is going to cross-cut, marketing, this particular division, the IT team, and all of this stuff to really make this thing happen. And how do we know before we do the project whether this project is going to bring us the ROI? So we coordinated that design, we projected the savings from the automation, we collected information from different departments, and in the end, we were able to propose an automation that resulted in 85% decrease in their manual labor involved in delivering this particular service. Well, I'm just going to grab a quick sip of water. All right, which then, of course, had other effects as well in that they're able to scale this new automation process much better, it's more reliable, and their customer experience for the end user is much, much better than it was before. So that's how we kind of applied these principles and the results that we've seen. I did promise you resources, and here we have a handful. There's a lot of them out there, of course. This is just some that I am familiar with and I've used. Strategyzer.com is full of tools. There's the business model canvas, the value proposition canvas that I talked about earlier. They're the ones who invented it. I really like the site boardofinnovation.com. They have a lot of different tools for a lot of different problems. So before you try to invent a new process or try to craft a new template for how you do things, check out those 2 sites, Strategyzer and Board of Innovation. They have a lot of tools already. They have culture maps. They have other things as well that I haven't talked about today. LeanStartup.co is Eric Ries's consulting org, and also they do they have been doing annual events, which I've been a regular attendee of, where a lot of leaders come in and talk about, innovation processes and how they've implemented it within their organizations. Radical Candor is not really about innovation so much as it is about culture. It is about having those conversations that are hard conversations, and how do you stay true to the intent of the group and the product and the organization versus being nice to people, right? And how afraid are you of having hard conversations? And that really help me to unlock making sure that high value conversations aren't getting short shrifted because you're afraid of, having a difficult conversation and finding ways to have that difficult conversation better. Agile Alliance is great for agile resources. Design thinking, of course, came out of IDEO, and they're still the leaders in delivering that. Feel free to check that out. Franklin Covey's book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution, I really love that one. It actually brings a lot of these concepts together because at the end of the day, if you're trying to do anything, different, you're basically in a transformation. And the 4 disciplines are really a transformation model of how you can move to prioritizing the thing that's you're most focused on and including that in your transformation and enrolling everybody in the organization on how to get that transformation. Chromatic.com is Tristan Kromer's site, and the book, the Real Startup book that I mentioned, that's where you can get it. So chromatic.com/real. All right. With that, that's the end of our talk for today. I know there was a lot of information there, so feel free to go back and review the recording. Erin, I'm sure we'll send the recording out to everybody to re-listen if you'd like. Here's some local resources too. So if you wanted to join our meetup group, Lean Startup Orlando, you can go to meetup.com and search for Lean Startup Orlando. You should be able to find it, register there. And our next event is, I think, coming up next week. We have Dr. Karen Tilstra, who's going to be speaking next week. She helped create the Florida Hospital's Innovation Lab, and she's of course, a major celebrity in the local area in terms of the amount of innovation labs and innovation efforts that she's been a part of personally. Starter Studio has a lot of great talks. So if you go to that, meetup.com, look for Starter Studio. They have a lot of great talks from local innovators as well as non-local innovators. StartupWeekinOrlando.com. You can check that out for registering for the event that's coming up. And of course, my website, our company's website, Informulate.com. If you go to our approach section, we have 3 frameworks there called Innovation Governance, SAMI, which stands for Standardize, Automate, Monitor, Iterate, which is a methodology for process automation and workflow automation, and Experiment, Execute, Transform, which is kind of what we covered to some extent today around new product development. So feel free to go read up on that as well, and feel free to send us an email, ask any questions, and of course, I'll open it up for questions here. Erin?
Great, thank you so much. As Rajiv just mentioned, if you all have any questions, we have about 10 minutes or so to address that, so I'll give you all a moment. And again, you can go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to speak directly to the group, and I'm happy to unmute you, or you can go ahead and use the chat function. Let me take a look real quick. I do have one question so far. Rajiv, so you mentioned some of the case studies throughout the discussion. Where can they find more information about those case studies? I have one person interested, particularly in LinkedIn and the Facebook case study that you were talking about.
Yeah, I moved back to that. So the case studies around Dropbox, Intuit, and Kiva. If you just use the keywords Dropbox Lean Startup Case Study, and same thing for Intuit and Kiva, you should be able to find them pretty easily. You can also go to leanstartup.co, which has a case studies section, which lists multiple case studies.
Great, thank you so much.
You are very welcome.
Okay. Any other questions? Or if anyone wants to share any experiences, it doesn't necessarily have to be questions. We can do like a fireside chat for the next couple of minutes. No?
Yeah, happy to talk about any direct things that are relevant to your current problems that you're trying to solve. Happy to answer questions like that.
Yeah, so we just have some comments saying great presentation, so wanted to share those. All right. So Sharon is just checking back in. She's on the website. She doesn't see the case study. So Sharon, we'll get in touch with you offline, and we can try to get that sorted out for the case studies. No worries there. Sorry about that. So as Rajiv mentioned, this session is recorded, so I'll go ahead and send out this recording, and of course it has the slides in there with all the great resources. So no later than tomorrow, you guys will go ahead and have access to the presentation. And it just takes me a little bit because it's a large file, so I just have to format it down. So just bear with me, and then I'll go ahead and share that out with you all by no later than tomorrow. I don't see any other questions or comments, so if everyone's okay with it, I can definitely give you back 10 minutes of your day, and I imagine we're all busy, so oh, I do have a hand raised. Vicky, let me go ahead and try to unmute you. Let's see if this works. If not, Vicky, if your mic isn't working, go ahead and use the chat function because I just tried unmuting you and for whatever reason it's not working. Oh, see, that was an accident. Okay. Alrighty. Rajiv, is it okay if we just go ahead and close out early, or if you had any other final thoughts?
More time in my day. I won't say no to that. But yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate your time and joining us today. There is a lot that this innovation methodology has to offer. So feel free to, as Aaron said, reach out separately, and you have my email address hopefully, and you can always refer to the recording there. But yeah, it is worth the effort once you start getting into it in terms of the ROI that you get from applying these methodologies. So thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day and stay safe.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.